is Kevin Jones, and I'm a postdoc at the University of California, San Francisco, working with the Neuroscape team. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit about some of our research projects, which help to enhance cognition and rescue cognition in sort of vulnerable older adults, those sort of maybe susceptible to cognitive decline, and as well as some of our future research projects working in clinical populations. And so first, what I'm going to talk about is just sort of the idea, what is cognitive decline? So I think we all know that our memory declines as we age, but there's a difference between healthy aging and those who are, you could say, are diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, sort of the precursor to a lot of diseases such as Alzheimer's, which leading to dementia. And so currently there's about 5.5 million Americans living with Alzheimer's. And this number is expected to quadruple over the next couple of decades as the aging baby boomer population continues to reach that time of their life where they're very vulnerable to these sort of diseases. And so when I say cognitive decline, I'm really talking about executive functioning. And that's sort of made up by a lot of the ways you do everyday tasks, such as using abilities such as working memory, maintaining attention, your cognitive control of what you're currently doing, what you plan on doing. And as you see in this graph on the right here, generally all those colored bars are the things you want to do, you use every day, your sort of long-term and your working memory, your short-term memory. And as you age throughout the lifespan, they all decline. Really the only thing that stays put is your sort of semantic memory for facts, for example. And so being able to even slightly sort of slow down that curve or even remediate lost abilities would have a gigantic benefit to the general public. And so that's really what our goal is here. And so I should first sort of define working memory here. As working memory and attention sort of work together to be what we call sort of multitasking. And so working memory is sort of this idea of just holding on to information that's really relevant to what you're doing at the moment. For example, you walk into the room and you have a task to do, or you have a phone number to write down, but you don't have your own phone or a piece of paper to write it down. Just sort of that rehearsal and maintaining information is critically important. And it's very valid to all sorts of everyday tasks. And so it's very tough, as you might know, because it's constantly fading. You constantly are paying attention to new items. So it's roughly thought to be about 3 or 4 items that you can hold at any one time. People used to think the whole 7 plus or minus 2 is what your working memory capacity is, but it's really thought to be 3 or 4 items. And we know this through how the way people perform in laboratory tasks. Their performance generally plateaus when you give them more than 3 or 4 items to remember at a time. And this is matched by sort of the way your body responds to behavioral tasks, like the response we can see in an fMRI scanner sort of plateaus after about 3 items, the way your blood flow moves throughout your brain, as well as identifiable EEG patterns, like the one I'm displaying below called the contralateral delay activity. You can see it plateaus as about 3 or 4 items. So we know it's very limited. It's not very many items at all to remember, especially given that it's really critical for things such as your academic grades. This is measured in medical students. Your overall IQ, there's a correlation between working memory capacity, the number of items you can hold, and your general fluid intelligence, your reading comprehension, as well as your multitasking ability, which is very critical to what I'll be talking about here. And so, given its importance to all these ecologically valid everyday tasks, is working memory capacity trainable? Like, can we improve our working memory, our attention, our general executive functioning? And so there's been a large push in the field to look at what we call brain training. It's over $1 billion industry. It's probably even more so now since I first looked this up. And we know a lot of examples of this, and I'm sure everybody listening will know as well. Some being Lumosity or Nintendo Brain Age. There's a whole bunch of these sort of brain training games that make grand claims about play this game and we will help you sort of fight off cognitive decline, or perhaps we'll help you get that super memory you've always dreamed of. And there's such a push to this. There's even a laboratory study, I believe, done in Italy where they're actually looking at cognitive training in elderly dogs with, I believe, some success, although I was not entirely sure why they went down that route. But I thought that was sort of interesting too. However, there's not really a great body of research showing these are particularly effective at benefiting anything in your everyday life that isn't simply the games you play. And so you get really good at playing Lumosity's little computer-based tasks, but you're not really getting any better at your everyday perspective memory, remember to do things, your ability to sort of drive, things like that. There's really no transfer of this training benefit, which is unfortunate. And Lumosity is particularly nefarious because they've even sort of been fined or settled with the FTC where the FTC claimed that they were preying on consumers' fears about age-related cognitive decline without any sort of science to really back up its ads. And so this is a big problem, and there's a lot of people making money without offering a whole lot of solutions. So really, what can be done to elicit these sort of reliable training gains that could then be scaled up the whole general population? And so this is one area that sort of has a stigma, the idea of using video games or something that isn't a basic laboratory task as a sort of training mechanism. And so there are some training studies behind my floating head there. There's studies showing you can train your working memory capacity to get better with laboratory studies. However, there's very little transfer benefit as well. It's very hard to find things that transfer beyond very related tasks at best. However, there are some studies showing that training with video games actually has a greater benefit than any of these commercial brain training products. For example, I believe Call of Duty was used to sort of train and improve non-experienced gamers' visuospatial attention and working memory skills. Games like Portal have shown to be more effective than Lumosity, which just sort of is more of a navigation problem puzzle solving game that's pretty fun. And the other thing that a lot of video games provide is the opportunity to collect big data, especially if they're already a widely popular game, particularly on a mobile device. And so there are some studies looking at, is brain training on mobile devices effective? And the overall result was probably not, but it did provide millions and billions of data points, which is really impossible to gather in a laboratory setting. And so there's this potential here that that thus far I haven't shown to be effective, but it does seem to be important. And a lot of these mobile games, like this one in the corner here, it was even used not for brain training, but researchers took the data from this game and actually applied changes to real life, the way real life TSA agents even scan items. And so they've had some applicability for sure. But the idea of using these things in a laboratory setting is a little bit novel. That's something that we here at Neuroscape have done. And so the first real foray into this was a study done here published back in 2013, looking at what if we used a sort of driving simulator video game to train older participants across the whole age span, basically driving and also doing some other attention tasks at the same time, like multitasking. So individuals either just drove the car, and here's a little demonstration of that, keeping it between these yellow lines, or they just trained on just pressing a button as quickly as they could when only the certain targets popped up, like that green circle, or they did them together, which is pretty difficult to drive and do a multitasking game at the same time, which, as you know, you shouldn't be texting and driving, but this is cognitively taxing. So being able to do both at the same time is difficult. And so what we did is we trained people either on nothing, just had them come in, do nothing, come back a month later and see how they improved on tasks. Had them train on just driving and just the sign task alone, or had them train on the multitasking together. And then we had them come back a month later and 6 months later to see if there's any benefit to this training. And what we found is that on the left here, you see this sort of black dots going down. That's basically the decades of lifespan. And as you'd expect, there's a bigger cost to multitasking. We have the idea that you perform worse when you do them together than you would individually. And as you'd expect, the group of participants in their 70s had a greater cost to multitasking than those in their 20s and 30s. However, the participants who had trained on multitasking had this big benefit a month later. You see this blue bar here, over the ones who trained on both of them individually, but when you train them together, they had a much higher performance. And this may even maintain 6 months later, which is a very long time point. So that's actually pretty impressive. On top of that, we also looked at the way the brain communicates with itself using EEG metrics. And what we found is, as you'd expect at baseline or before training, older and younger adults' brains were operating very differently. Older adults' brains change the way they communicate. There's atrophy. Generally, the patterns shift from one part of the brain to the other. And as you see, this sort of hotspot here is showing a sort of general midline frontal theta activity, a frequency we know is important to multitasking, generally in the 4 to 7 or 8 hertz range. And we see that in younger adults and absent in the older adults, sort of mirroring their behavioral performance as well. However, after training, you see the multitasking training older adult group has this very high posterior or frontal theta power, which is less so seen in the single task and very hardly seen at all in the no contact control group. basically showing that this behavioral improvement was mirrored in the electrophysiological activity recorded in the brain, sort of demonstrating how important it is to tie the way your brain works to behavior. And so that brings me to a tool that we've been applying to research I've been doing for quite a while, called non-invasive electrical neurostimulation. There's a whole slew of different techniques you can do, be like magnetic stimulation, direct current stimulation at the top here, and transcranial alternating current stimulation, or tACS, you'll hear me call it, or random noise stimulation. They all have different applications, both clinical and research, and rehabilitation, especially motor functioning. And the military is getting very excited about vagus nerve stimulation, but there's a lot of different topics that this is applied to. But I'm just going to focus just on tACS, or tACS. And the popularity of these studies has really sort of taken off in research fields basically since the year 2000. And this is just a number of studies per year. And you can see tDCS is used a lot. And tACS is really starting to slowly pick up, the sort of orange there. But they sort of have slightly different mechanisms. So tDCS is just a direct current. There's a positive or an anode, or a negative and a cathode. One end hyperpolarizes, one depolarizes. So if you know population neurons that are specific to a task, you can target them and see if performance changes. However, here, I'm going to be talking about tACS, which is able to entrain neurons. And I should say, while this technique has really only been used research-wise since the 2000s, the idea of using electricity to treat people has been used for a very long time. I mean, electroconvulsive therapy, which is generally about 3,000 times stronger, it's been used for decades. However, even I believe over 2,000 years ago, the ancient Greeks used electric eels to treat people. It would shock people and find benefits, and that was done by none other than Pliny the Elder. If you follow beer, you know that name. So this isn't a particularly new technique, however, applying it in such a small dose that specific areas is. And so what tACS does is, there's a whole bunch of lines on the screen. This is just a general raw EEG pattern from some series of time collected in the brain. And you can sort it into different frequency bands: gamma, beta, alpha, theta, delta, etc. However, what you can do with tACS is you can target a very specific part of the brain with a specific frequency. Say this is theta range, let's say 6 hertz. So about 6 times a second, you're going to see this, it's going to shoot back and forth between the two electrodes every second. And what that does is it alters the local field potential of the neurons directly beneath or in between these electrodes, to the point where all of these electrodes are now going to fire in sync with the peaks and troughs of the ongoing current wave. And so going back to that multitasking driving game that we performed in the past, we more recently applied tACS in healthy younger adults in a single session without training, just to see if we could improve performance or sort of shortcut training gains by applying that frontal theta tACS we saw was important in older adults in a single session. And so what we found is just having them come in and play this game 16 times while receiving stimulation for about half of those trials, the group that received stimulation to the sort of midline frontal theta wave target, as compared to a sham group, actually had a behavioral improvement in a single session. So the black dots up here, this is just their performance. It went from not significant between them to significant, whereas the sham control group really didn't have any behavioral improvements. And in addition to just theta, sort of broad range improvements in the power, not even improvements, just an increase in the power spectra was observed at the post session compared to the pre-session, and only the group that received tACS as opposed to the control group. And this very much mimics the results I showed you before, however, only within a single day. So that's really exciting. If we can boost performance in younger adults in one session, and that sort of follows the pattern of month-long training in older adults, that shows a lot of potential for shortcutting training gains when you know exactly what to target. And so very recently, we just finished data collection on pairing these two together. So we trained 60 healthy older adults with tACS plus NeuroRacer in a single week. So they would come in on Monday, they would get a structural MRI. We collect EEG sessions every day, and we would sort of have them come in and do some thresholding, get their MRI, figure out where to do some transfer tasks, and then have them come back Tuesday through Friday, where they would receive tACS with EEG recorded immediately before and after the tACS sessions. and come in and train on NeuroRacer every day. And then come back a month later to see how they improve. And that was very time consuming. It just finished after, I believe, almost 2 years of data collection or more. And what we found is, just looking at 2 of the groups we ran people on 6 hertz, which is what we believe to be sort of an advantageous frequency from all the data I just showed you, as well as 1 hertz, the sort of a control frequency. They're still getting the same dose of stimulation, but it's not at a frequency we believe to be helpful. And as you see, this is just a change in cost. So anything above the x-axis is the participants being more able to multitask, having less of a sort of hindrance from having to do the sign and drive game together. And as you see, the blue bar both as a sort of increased slope and increased overall cost as opposed to the 1 hertz, sort of replicating our findings and extending it to older adults, which is exciting. And this was mirrored with reaction time gains. So now anything down below is a sort of a cost increase, or they're basically performing quicker despite having to do both tasks at the same time. So that was really exciting. And that maintained a follow-up, this difference between the 2 frequency groups. And so on top of that, I told you we collected MRI data. And what we've been doing is we've been modeling the electrical current using some software to actually demonstrate where throughout the cortex this current likely went, modeled all through their skin, their fat, their skull, their gray white matter CSF. And then we correlated each voxel in the brain where the electricity went with their performance, or their sort of slope of improvement. So sort of speed at which they improved during the sessions tACS was happening, to sort of get a model of what voxels in the brain might be important. And so we really didn't know what to expect from this, but what we really found is that this is the 6 hertz group here. And anywhere you see this like sort of fire looking color, their brain is not burning, but those are voxels that were correlated with behavioral improvements. So electricity reaching these regions, and ignore the sort of specks that represent sort of spurious CSF that will be wiped out when we do more cluster corrections. You can see it's basically, so both hemispheres, especially down these white matter tracks throughout the brain. Basically showing that electricity, 6 hertz frequency going through these regions was correlated with higher slope, a greater improvement, better speed of training gains. And if you look in the 1 hertz group, this was entirely absent. And so even though some of them, they improved, there was almost no correlation with where in the brain the electricity went. And so that was really exciting. And then if we actually make little masks just within the white matter, you can see that there's a perfect, almost perfect correlation with only the 6 hertz group on the left here, not observed in the 1 hertz group on the right, showing that within those masks, this is just an F3 or left prefrontal mask alone. This was replicated on the right side as well as bilaterally. There's a great correlation between electrical field on the x-axis strength and that within that ROI and change in the cost, or their slope basically, on the y-axis. And so that was really exciting. And this is something that I don't believe other research groups have done before, but we're gonna now sort of use this to apply to future studies. And in the future, hopefully next year, we're going to begin replicating this exact study, however, in patients with mild cognitive impairment. MCI patients, to sort of see if we can either slow down cognitive decline or rescue lost cognitive abilities, which would be fantastic. However, another goal of Neuroscape is really to move neuroscience out of the laboratory. And so a study we've just begun collecting data on over the last 2 weeks is we're taking, having participants come in and collect some baseline data sessions on them, train them to how to go home and apply neurostimulation to themselves, and then play 5 days of training while receiving neurostimulation with Evo, which is a company made by a company named Akili, which took the NeuroRacer game and is now applying it to clinical populations. But we're gonna see if doing this in the home with tACS is going to be as effective. And if so, that could potentially show that the bottleneck of just participants in rooms and hospitals, et cetera, could be possibly shortcut by having a very real life in a real home setting, rehabilitation or technique for cognitive enhancement. And so that is what we're working on at the moment. I believe that is the end of my talk. So I hope you enjoyed that. It was a very brief overview of what we're working on here. And thanks.
And welcome to the chatting part of the Digital Health Core Seminar Series. I'm Joaquin Hongera. I'm the director of the Digital Health Core with my new best friend, Girish Subramanian.
Hey, Joaquin.
And I'm not going to say your last name again, but today we're brought to you by, thanks Kevin Jones, Pliny the Elder. Great idea. Tip of the cap to you, sir. So we just heard about a really interesting idea from Kevin and a research study that kind of talked about different ways in which we could potentially help older adults with their memory and attention, what have you, using a combination of video games and stimulation. I think back to my 15-year-old self. I like video games. I would not stimulate myself then. Maybe I would. But the idea of using this is pretty radical, and because there is some efficacy, some evidence that says maybe a combination of this could be really good. And it's fascinating to think that anything like this would be something that people would reach out to and look for in the first place. Given that you have a practice, what do you think?
Well, I think Kevin's talk was fascinating. I'm always interested in new modalities of intervention and treatment. As you know, I'm an adult psychiatrist here in the city. Work a lot with patients who have mood and anxiety disorders, attention deficit disorders, personality disorders. Don't see a whole lot of dementia in my practice because I'm not a geriatric psychiatrist, but I definitely see a fair amount of older individuals who have cognitive decline, and certainly they have concerns like, oh my God, am I going to get dementia?
Yeah.
And what can I do? Most of the time what I end up doing is referring people to neuropsychiatric evaluation to get baseline assessments of their cognitive functioning, which just tells us something about a snapshot in time about their cognitive abilities. But there's not a whole lot that we can really recommend at that point in order to slow down the progression.
And I'm guessing these folks are really eager to find something. They're almost desperate sometimes just because of the concern that something's slipping, something's not going right. They're trying to find an answer.
It's anxiety producing, to say the least. Yeah, people freak out when their memory is not working well. I mean, just yesterday, for example, as an anecdote, I have a patient who I see maybe every other week or so in psychotherapy, and he notices that every time that he's sleep deprived, his cognition, his cognitive abilities are a lot worse. But it's to the point that it's causing functional impairments these days in his life. He can't remember why he walked into a room. He couldn't, he can't come up with the names of certain things. It's better when he's, well rested, but he's had chronic insomnia for much of his adulthood, and it's definitely causing problems now, even to the extent that he got lost in his own neighborhood the other day, which is kind of, striking when you're driving and you've been driving in the city in the same neighborhood for many, many years, and you get lost in your own neighborhood.
Yeah, that's
so he was freaked out.
That's another level.
Yeah, okay. And for our listeners and for our viewers, I think it might be helpful just to throw out some statistics.
Yeah.
As Kevin mentioned, about 5.5 million adults in the U.S. have Alzheimer's dementia right now. That number is projected to triple or quadruple in the next several decades. It's an illness that costs currently about $200 billion, to care for, but it's projected to increase to $1 trillion in the next 30, 40 years. And it's about, it's staggering.
It's staggering.
Yeah, it's about 1 in 10 adults over the age of 65 have dementia, and about 1 in 5, or 20%, have mild cognitive impairment, which is a precursor condition that leads to dementia.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So normally, in those situations, with MCI or what have you, these individuals are going down the slippery slope, per se, where maybe they're beginning to notice these impairments in their quality of life, and they're looking for some kind of solution to try to keep things afloat.
Exactly.
And so, thinking back to what Kevin talked about, some of the research that and some of others are pretty familiar with this NeuroRacer story, the idea that a video game that isn't a really video game, but it kind of is, could actually have beneficial effects is pretty exciting. I mean, in this case, playing a game for a month that would lead these older adults to have outcomes that resemble that of a 20-year-old is obviously very sexy and very exciting. And you could see how many would run with that and say, this is the greatest thing in the world, but there's more to it, obviously. And for someone in your position, you'd have to maybe diagnose or provide this. You'd have to believe in it, right? And there has to be some evidence behind these kind of things in the first place.
Yeah, and I think what you guys are doing at Neuroscape is pretty much right on target with what needs to be demonstrated. First you do these preliminary studies that show some efficacy in the cognitive domains that you're looking at. And in this case, you're able to show durability of benefits 1 and 6 months out.
Exactly.
What you'd need to next show, I think, is that it translates into cognitive domains maybe outside of the immediate ones that are being tested, and possibly functional improvements too. By definition, MCI does not cause the level of functional impairment that dementia does, but and there are no treatments yet for MCI per se. But everyone who's in that position or a loved one who's dealing with a mild cognitive impairment is worried about the possibility of dementia a few years down the road.
Yeah.
And I bet that they would want to do anything that's reasonable and evidence-based and practical that they could use to slow down the progression into dementia.
Absolutely. And I think the idea of these interventions that we use here at Neuroscape and others try to do, they're interventions. They're trying to fix a problem. And the idea of trying to slow down and maybe take off the steepness of these slopes of decline is something that's really exciting and possible, I think. But I think what's even more exciting is the idea of using some of these technologies as preventative. Just like we go to the gym to stay healthy. I mean, we were talking about this offline a moment ago. There's a brain gym just down the street from here where people will go and try to work out their brains in VR, which is a fascinating concept, maybe just one that's only in the Bay Area, but it's fascinating nonetheless. I think I want to go try it. I'd be curious to see what happens, but nevertheless, the idea that there's something out there and there's a movement starting that people might use these technologies to try to improve their current function, to try to stave off some of these negative effects, to kind of prolong their quality of life, is a very interesting idea. And the idea that tACS, the stimulation that you could potentially just take home, put on your head on your own, that's really interesting, especially if you can do more than just either of these things alone.
Yeah, there's a lot in there, what you said, Joaquin. I think, this is a part of the country where people are very interested in taking things into their own hands. Often people have an entrepreneurial spirit here. They want to use the latest developments in technology to improve their day-to-day life. So I think that I'm not surprised that people are interested in cognitive training. I mean, I think Kevin himself spoke about Lumosity and the impact that particular company has had. Certainly, with something along the lines of what you're doing here at Neuroscape that's more evidence-based, I think that if you could offer that, people would probably sign up for something that's more evidence-based than something that has less evidence.
Yeah.
But I think what's fascinating about video games is that, as we talked about before, you can target certain neural circuits with these technologies, and most of the interventions that we have in psychiatry don't do that.
Most interventions being like drugs, you're saying?
Most interventions are medications.
Okay.
Yeah, so in psychiatry, I think by far and away the largest kind of intervention we use are medications, and then psychotherapy would be next. Psychotherapy is often a part of most illnesses that we treat. And psychotherapy probably does target certain neural circuits because it creates an experience, like a video game experience, which is just going to be maybe more diffuse than what a video game can target. Mm-hmm. But medications, they bind to receptors that are diffusely expressed in the brain. They're not often very elegantly designed, so they're not targeting. If we think about most psychiatric conditions as functional neurological disorders that implicate certain neural circuits, they're not particularly well suited to treat those. They're targeting diffuse neural networks.
Yeah.
Of course, we're getting the benefits, but we're also getting a lot of things that we don't necessarily want.
Side effects,
and they're not demonstrated to cause plastic changes in the brain. So if you're depressed and you're on Effexor, and you've had multiple episodes and you decide, I don't want to be on this thing any longer, it's very likely that you'll relapse. So they don't have that kind of durable effect. Only few things in our field seem to have that durable effect.
Which is interesting then, I guess, to think about what Kevin talked about in that original Nature paper. 6 months later, some of these benefits still persisted.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
And the idea that any type of these electrical stimulations, whether it's tACS or transcranial magnetic stimulation that I know you're familiar with, you can have some of these duration, these durability, these positive effects that don't just go away.
It's amazing. I think that when you use electrical stimulation to target certain neural circuits, and you potentiate the kind of communications between those neural circuits using electrical stimulation, you're obviously doing something to those neurons to improve their communication with target neurons. Mm-hmm. And that seems to be kind of a more durable, plastic, lasting effect than other kinds of interventions.
Do you find that the folks are amenable to doing this rather than taking drugs, at least from your experience?
Frankly, people are not just amenable to it, they would prefer it in some instances.
Even though it kind of feels funny when something kind of flicking your head of these signals?
Even when that's the case. So that's usually not I think you're referring to transcranial magnetic stimulation, which can be uncomfortable on the scalp, but that's usually not what is deterrent. What's more of a deterrent is the cost. So people would sign up for TMS in my practice if they knew that it could help their depression and they didn't need to take a medication and they only need to do it for 6 weeks and they could have benefits that are long lasting.
Like 12 months, right?
I mean, the studies are 12-month durability studies, but it's not clear that it's just 12 months. It may be longer than that.
Could be longer.
Yes, yeah. So, this kind of non-invasive neural stimulation produces more plastic changes, long-lasting changes in the brain that, can often help people minimize their reliance on medications, for example, which are side effect prone.
Yeah. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's just exciting to think that these technologies that are so accessible, that a video game that in this case you probably could play now on your iPad or your phone.
Yeah.
And tACS is a technology that really is getting closer to consumer grade that we can have and put on our own heads and just go from there. Maybe the possibility seems to be there that we can get a synergistic effect where 1 + 1 = 7 in terms of cognitive benefits by putting them together in a careful and thoughtful way and get that much more out of them.
Yeah, I think that is a fascinating part of Kevin's talk, that when you add these two technologies together, you see, improvements like that. And the fact that tACS can be portable is just really exciting to me. TMS is not a portable solution. You have to go to a center to get the treatment, and it is a costly, procedure, and it's an expensive machine to own.
Yeah.
But these tACS devices, if they can be, brought to consumer level costs and ease of use, and you could actually target certain neural circuits while you're doing an intervention, like the interference intervention of Project Evo or Neuroracer. That's something that I think I can imagine people signing up for. Just like they might exercise 30 minutes a day, I can imagine that they might decide they want to do something like this to preserve their cognitive functioning.
It's amazing. Yeah, it's really exciting to think that we're on the cusp of this incredible revolution of using digital technologies as the treatment and interventions and preventative medicine for a whole host of things, and maybe MCI and these kind of things are just the start.
I think it is the start. I think we're going to see probably in the next couple of decades more digital therapeutics. There's an elegance to them in that they target certain neural circuits. They seem to have more durable effects. They're less side effect prone. And I think that we'll probably be early adopters here in the Bay Area, just because that's how things are in general.
Sounds about right.
But I think that we do have an influence on culture at large, and things will probably spread from there. Yeah.
Well, that's a good point to end, I think. Thanks again. Thanks to Pliny and Kevin. And for all those at home, thanks for taking the time to listen, and we'll talk again soon. Look for the next one.
Thanks, Joaquin.
Bye.